Welcome to the first in a series of Journalism and the Pandemic Project webinars co-hosted by ICFJ and the Tao Centre for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. Today we're asking, how is COVID-19 transforming journalism? I'm ICFJ's Director of Research, Julie Posetti. And I just want to tell you a little bit about the study we're doing with the Tao Centre before I introduce our guests. So the effects of COVID-19 are already being framed as an extinction event for journalism. We know that dozens of news outlets around the world and thousands of jobs have been shredded. And we also know that we have to map and track the impacts of this pandemic on journalism and journalists in particular and other media workers if we are to try to inform the recovery and also to help reimagine the future of journalism when we ultimately hope this pandemic is over. So this week, we are officially launching a global survey that's been in the field now for nearly 2 weeks, which we put out with the Tao Centre, that's looking at 6 key themes: the business and practice of journalism, journalism safety and press freedom impacts, the impacts of the pandemic era disinfodemic or infodemic as it's being called on journalists and journalism, audience engagement and development. So you can take this survey that we're talking about today via the ICFJ website, and our colleagues are going to post that link to the survey in the Zoom chat several times throughout the conversation. But to officially launch this survey, we're joined today by celebrated CEO and editor Maria Ressa from Rappler in the Philippines, CNN's executive editor of Digital Worldwide, Inga Thordar, prominent South African editor, Ferial Haffajee from the Daily Maverick, and my co-researcher, Professor Emily Bell, who's director of the Tao Centre. So together we're going to try and identify and debate the key challenges confronting journalism at what is really a transformative moment, and we'll consider the prospects for recovery. So please, we want you in our audience. We know we have several hundred people registered for this webinar, and we really hope you'll participate. So put your questions in the forum. And with that, I'm going to hand to Emily, my collaborator, for the first question.
Hi everybody, welcome to the webinar. I'm here in New York, Julie's over there in the UK, so nobody's really in the place that matches with their national identity. As Julie says, make sure that you are looking out for the link and filling in the survey. Julie, actually I just want to start with you before we come to our fantastic panel, which is just to say, even though this is the official launch, we put the survey into the field a couple of weeks ago and have had a really sort of extraordinarily large response to it already. Is there anything you can tell us from the survey data that you've looked at so far, just in terms of snapshots?
Sure, and you're getting world first exclusive data here, people. But this is a snapshot that I took on Thursday evening, the 21st of May, at which point we had about 1,700 I have to say, highly engaged participants. I can tell you that half of the people who've responded, just over half, are women. 43%, this is a stat that is sobering, have either lost their jobs, been furloughed, had their salaries cut, or their hours and assignments reduced. And within that figure, 6% of them have said that they have lost their jobs entirely, which I think is sadly a figure that we expect to rise, but is very much indicative of the depth of the crisis. We also asked people to rank some of their concerns about, with a level of difficulty identified in reference to a range of labels like unemployment, psychological and emotional effects. Those, in fact, were the two most difficult as ranked by the participants. They also identified things like intensity of workload, social isolation, interestingly balancing childcare and working from home, which is something that is very much familiar to those of us who are working parents struggling with this pandemic. And the other thing that I think I'll highlight is the top ranked needs that journalists and news organisations who've completed this survey so far have identified. And you won't be surprised to hear that 73% of respondents ranked funding to cover operating costs as their most urgent need, followed by the need for advanced verification and fact-checking skills, which I think is important to note, and very much segs with our recognition that we have a major crisis around disinformation that's connected to trust here. Training in science and medical health reporting, physical safety, press freedom advocacy. These are some of the things that people have identified. And I'll leave it there for now, but Emily and I plan to report on this survey, not necessarily while it's in the field, but as soon as possible after we're able to take a rigorous sample and do some analysis, because this is as urgent for us to learn from as it is for you to do. So I think on that note, let's hand it over to our panelists. What do you think, guys? I think it's time to hear from you. So
yes.
I'm wondering, in fact, Emily, perhaps you can take this one.
Yeah,
I think the first thing that we need to really ask is about the business. Yeah?
I was going to say, it's like it's the thing that I start all panels with, which is what's going on in your business right now. I know it seems like a very boring and generic question, but we get such different and rich answers out of it. So let's start. Shall we start off with you, Maria? You've had so many challenges at Rappler, and now you have the coronavirus challenge. So how is Rappler adapting? What are you finding the main challenges in your business? Oh, unmute. Sorry, that's the other thing I say at the top of the
that's the first step. Sorry about that. So, strangely enough, this is our 4th year that we're under attack. And all those years that we've been under attack actually placed us in a good place to deal with the coronavirus, if that even is possible, in the sense that we had so many contingency plans. We had built up kind of all the support networks we needed. And then when the lockdown happened, when the pandemic happened, all of a sudden, all of those these crisis things kicked in. Workflows, different ways of doing things, even things like my court case. One of the 8 court cases that are live right now was supposed to have gotten a verdict scheduled during the lockdown. It's been now postponed indefinitely, postponed twice and then indefinitely. But I think the hardest thing for us is that, we've been facing closure for 4 years, and yet we weren't the ones shut down. On May 5th, ABS-CBN, which is the largest broadcaster, it's the largest news, multimedia news platform in the Philippines, essentially they went dark. The Philippine government went after them. Well, this is not what they would say. The Philippine government will say that their franchise expired. ABS-CBN will say that, they've been politically attacked, that their franchise was they were effectively shut down by the Duterte government. And this has not happened since the days of Ferdinand Marcos. And after ABS-CBN was shut down, you had 14 years of a dictatorship. So what are we facing? Aside from the normal things, the fight for press freedom, which has become part of our norm, you also have 1,000 journalists inside ABS-CBN who since May 5th, that entire network has not earned any money. By their own estimate, they say they've lost between 30 million to 35 million pesos a day. It's 50 pesos to the dollar. So you're talking about roughly 600,000 to 700,000 US dollars. At the end of a month, that's a billion pesos or 21 million US dollars. That's a lot. And that means that the president has said they will start laying people off. That's 1,000 journalists. So it feels like, quick answer, survival. Our job is more critical today than ever, and we are fighting harder to survive.
Can I throw that question to you, Ferial? I mean, Maria points to the long struggle that has been Rappler's attempt to survive amid myriad, crises and assaults. Of course, struggle is very familiar to South African journalists. For 20 years, you've now been a democracy, or more than 20 years. But what are you struggling with most in terms of trying to sustain a business like Daily Maverick, which is doing incredibly important, robust journalism, but for a comparatively elite audience as well.
Thank you. It's lovely to be on this sisterly panel. So the Daily Mavericks is quite a different story, and I'll get to that to save the good news for last. So I checked in with my colleagues in Kenya, in Nigeria, a couple of other regional centers on our continent, and the words they were using when I spoke to them was media geddon, print geddon, so really, really bad. And so they all reported that they've seen this, the COVID bump that we're all talking about, massive increases in eyeballs and audiences, but the COVID slump also taking thousands of jobs. So in South Africa, Julie, almost all the magazines that you'd have seen on the shelves when you came have gone to the wall in the past couple of months. So I think that's an industry gone. It really does seem to be the end of print as the major media market on our continent, and certainly in South Africa, because the distribution model has just died in lockdown. And then online, you see really hitting those big audience increases, which has been great to see. I spoke to Ori Okola on Twitter, and she was saying that she really feels like radio has come into its own again as a source of information and education, and public television, or in some cases state television, delivering important information. So those have been quite interesting trends. Just a little bit of my good news is the Daily Maverick, because we didn't have the legacy issues of all the old media here, is really a counter-narrative story where actually it's in a big growth phase, and it's not put in place the wage cuts that are probably a story of all my colleagues in South Africa, and it certainly seems in the rest of Africa. And maybe we can talk about the success later of its membership model and how that's really, really borne fruit in this time, and what that relationship has meant.
Yeah, let's definitely come back to that.
Yes, I was going to say, I think that's a great point, and we want to we don't want to leave everybody completely gloomy. So at the end of this, I think it would be great to hear about what's actually working. Inga, let's sort of turn to you. So people don't think about the big networks like CNN as being at all vulnerable to crises. You know, you are the robust and the most robust part of advertising supported free media. What's the experience been like being in a global network?
Well, I mean, you talk about the sort of business side of it. So let's start there. I mean, I think very few companies are immune from the severe economic downturn that we're facing, and CNN is no exception to that. It might not be at the scale that we're hearing from others, but it certainly will be felt. But I mean, I think we have known for a while that that journalism can't just rely on advertising revenue. Neither can sustainable businesses be built on the sort of backs of platforms. So for those reasons, we have now for quite some time, our main focus has been to invest in our own platforms and our own user experiences. And we've also for a while been sort of trying to diversify our revenue away from just the ad model. And that has sort of paid off for us up to a point. I mean, I can name one success story for us has been the commerce business in the US, underscored. But I believe that it would be wrong to say that those big networks won't be affected, because, you know, every business in the world right now is being affected, including the big networks. But I think we have not had to go down the route of furloughing anyone. Neither have we had to go down the route of wage cuts, which is definitely a very positive thing for our staff. But I do want to mention one thing, because we talk about, people starting to work from home and how legacy organizations aren't often very agile. But I think in this case, CNN has been exceptionally agile. We had to start working from home in certain areas like really quickly, and moving an organization of this size, everyone to their homes, continue to have a 24-hour television network, 24-hour digital operation is quite a feat. And I do think it speaks to the agility of the people within those organizations to move quickly with the times that has been done. in a remarkable way, in a remarkable time.
Can I just check, we didn't check with you, Maria, or Ferial, whether you have furloughed or had to lay off staff at this point? I know most of you are working from home, but what about the issue of job losses?
So not at the Daily Maverick, but certainly in the rest of the industry.
Yeah. Maria?
Not at Rappler. In fact, we're hiring, because we had come from a point where, you know, we had cut ourselves down in terms of our own pay. For 4 years, right? So we had cut our pay down, the founders and our managers, and then by 2018, when all the cases had been filed, 2019, when they were in court, by 2019, we were growing again. So we're actually, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. We're actually in a very good place.
Which is extraordinary.
Fingers crossed.
I was going to say, I think this must be the only collection of editors in the world who can all say we're not actually cutting staff, which is great to hear. Sorry, Julie.
No, I was going to say we are looking for hope, understandably, as humans, but also as journalists. So it's great to find some. I was just going to move the conversation now, in fact, back to you, Inga, because you talked about this agility required to move a vast staff from offices around the world, and I wanted to move now into this challenge of reporting an incredibly complex story, but in a revolutionary way, with social distancing and isolation and not furloughs, but working from home and so on. And you mentioned, that it was a feat to do. The other thing I've noticed about CNN's coverage is that you're actually reporting on working from home, among other things. But what else have you done? How have you tried to transform what you're doing to keep programs on air and to keep accountability journalism going?
Well, I think that there's sort of like several challenges. We mentioned one of them is sort of moving people to their homes to start working, and that comes with its challenges. Many of them you raised at the beginning of this webinar around what you're hearing. Certainly you're having to deal with childcare, at home, and people who have very young children who are having, to kind of deal with that. And then you have to deal with homeschooling if you've got older children, and, speaking from experience, that hasn't always been wholly successful in my household. But, I think that, and then there's also, the expectation that you would have the facilities at home to do that. And not everyone does that. I have a team in Lagos, and I can't tell you how difficult it is to work in a city where there's regular power cuts, et cetera, to then, have those. So there's a huge logistical challenges and huge personal challenges that people have to get through. And we have tried to the best of our abilities to meet those and be understanding and give people different times. So people might not be working the same hours they used to, not the same days that they used to, and try to show some flexibility in that. And on the whole, I think we've landed in a sort of a decent place, and people have stayed motivated. Now, on that, I've been in this business for a while now, and I've never experienced a story like this, so it is incredible, and it's probably going to be the story of our careers. And I do think that is an incredibly motivating factor. We are seeing a huge spike in audiences, and they are in desperate need for information, for good information, I should add, and reliable information. So we have been trying to meet that need in the various forms. You mentioned we've been dealing with working from home. Well, that's been on people's minds everywhere. So we, our business team started a whole series just on that to kind of address the issues that people might be facing, how we can help with that, what we can do, the sort of, journalism you can use. Then on the international side, we've been working really hard to, lean into CNN's global reach and expertise to really join the dot, get people to understand that what happens in one place can travel to another place, how these things work together, and the sort of geopolitics of the virus, as well as just the human tragedy of the virus. So we've been trying to watch where our audience is going, how we can help them understand this incredible story. And I think that the power of this story is really motivating our staff to do the best, journalism of their career. And I could not be prouder of my own team, certainly, and and my colleagues in the US who've been dealing with that. But it would be amiss of me not to mention that news gathering is a major challenge. I mean, moving people around the world right now for us is it's an epic task, and getting our journalists on the ground where they really can see what's going on and report is difficult. I mean, flights are difficult. You then, once you get there, you obviously, we have been very rigid about our, safety of the people we're speaking to, as well as the safety of our own journalists. But then it's when they come back, everyone has to be quarantined for a while. So that does hamper our ability to keep reporting. So, this is definitely not without its challenges. But, as I said, we are all incredibly committed to this story. And so we'll face them as they come.
I think that's a great point about just the logistics, which people don't think about, particularly when you're reporting a story. To even put a journalist into an environment, you change the story. So there's a sort of a really added sort of a layer of difficulty. So I was going to ask Maria, just on those logistics of reporting, what are the things how is Rappler getting around keeping your staff safe, but also keeping them out there? Are you doing much in the field reporting at the moment?
The Philippines has had, I think we may have the longest lockdown globally right now. We're in our 11th week. And there was a period of time when we were essentially just quarantined in our home. Our president threatened to shoot anyone who violated quarantine. But in terms of reporting, our folks are just starting to go out. But at one point, we really asked everybody to stay home because it was so unclear. Everybody knows that the public health, this virus only exacerbated all of the underlying problems that were there in our societies. And our lockdown was largely led by security forces. It was led by the police and the military, and our testing, I think, came very, very late. And so at one point we had no idea how bad it was. And I had 3 of my teams exposed, and we realized that we couldn't even get an ambulance to get one of our guys out. We had to make sure that we called the hospital, made arrangements to pick up one of our guys who turned out, well, we don't know. He never got his test results back, but he's now fine. So that scared me. And so we kept everyone home for a long period of time. Manila is just coming out of this now, but we're still on a form of a lockdown.
What about you, Ferial?
Journalists here were declared an essential service, unlike in many parts of Africa where they actually can't work, find it hard to go out, harassed often by the police, but that doesn't happen to us. But being a small institution without big medical coverage, our editor is trying for zero positives amongst our staff, which means that you have to really think on your feet about how you're going to cover it, how you're going to build relationships on a front line of doctors, nurses, etc., who are very busy, and some have made time for us to do so. I guess what really brought it home for me was when a camera person at one of our TV stations became the first journalist to die. And I think in that moment of common mourning, you realize we are also part of that front line, and the dangers, but also the challenges of reporting a polymath of a story, because it's at once an economic story, a medical story, a health story, epidemiology. And I'm not sure that we have the specializations in our country and even at the Maverick to be able to tell all the dimensions of the story and to do so really, really quickly. So I was quite interested in hearing other views on that, because it's not just a health story at all any longer.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really good point. It's a story that has so many intersections, from health through to sport. Yeah.
I think that's a great point. And I think sort of coming back to that as well in turn, it'd be great to hear from people as well in the comments, because we have a lot of the ICFJ network asking us questions about what they're seeing in terms of those beat questions. But just to sort of stay for a minute with the sort of management, you're all kind of, you're all managing teams. And Ferial, you mentioned that, it really brings it home to you when you have colleagues or friends of colleagues who are actually sort of coming down with the virus as well. I mean, first of all, sort of, how much have you been dealing with, the virus as something that's affected your teams directly, but also how are you managing the sort of the broader effects on your staff? I know that we all have days where we feel both energized. I think it's a really great point that Inga was making about, the focus of the story. So we all feel energized, but there must be also kind of enormous strains which go beyond logistics on your teams. I was wondering what you're seeing in those and how you manage them. So Inga, maybe sort of come to you first on that.
There is definitely strains on teams, and we shouldn't sort of, I mean, and especially now when I think, I might be counting right, but we're in week 9, 10 over here in London, and I had a team in Hong Kong that was, started to go into the office just this week after 12 weeks away. So I think it comes in sort of highs and lows. So some weeks are really good, other weeks are not. And I think that for me, it's sort of recognizing when the low points are and sort of writing that out in many ways and see how we can support. But I mean, as the weeks progress, it will definitely become a little bit more challenging to sort of deal with that. But I mean, the main thing that we've had is around childcare. That is a huge issue, and one that we can't ignore the strains that brings to two parents maybe, or even single parents. Majority of whom in the world are women, who are dealing with maybe 2 kids, one homeschooling kids and a toddler, and then having to deal with like the biggest story of their career. I mean, that is incredible strain. So we've been trying to make sure that people take time off. That they move away from the computer. Also, this story has the capacity to get you incredibly depressed. You're dealing with, numbers and tragedies around the world, human tragedies that are just, incredible and can really take their toll. So again, stepping away from the story for a while, doing something completely different, walking outside whenever you're allowed to, and those things. I do think that that's important, and we have been trying to sort of stress that, that without people keeping their sort of own mental health going, we won't keep the story going. So that's, I think that's really important. But I think recognizing that there's going to be ups and downs, and writing the downs, knowing that, on the whole, journalists are resilient creatures is probably how I've been trying to get there.
They often say that investigative journalists in particular are like the cockroaches of the journalism world, and we can make, we can hope that endures.
We mean cockroaches in a good way, like very resilient.
In the sense that they survived the apocalypse.
Yes. Just to be clear about that. For real, in fact, it's just occurring to me that I've spoken to all of you in totally separate settings about the problem of burnout and what we do about it. Yeah. So Ferial, how are you managing that sort of prospect, particularly on a small team?
I think you'll enjoy this story, Emily. We are a small team, and we don't have a vast wellness facility where we can direct people to. So we have this insider group of members that Julia has written about. And actually just this week, our managing editors were reporting high now, a lot of burnout, a lot of mental exhaustion. And one of those insiders offered their services to counsel our journalists. So I thought that was a really lovely showing, not just of paying, but really feeling yourself to be part of the community. And I'm sure many of our journalists are going to take that up. Of course, I have to point out that in South Africa, I mean, I can't imagine what it's like working in New York, where my friends tell me you hear the sirens all the time. Another one describes cities in Acropolis. So yeah, our death rate is not that high, and already we have an extremely high reported incidence of mental health issues, burnout amongst journalists. So I thought that was just a nice example for you of how your membership will really come to your rescue because they feel a part of your institution.
It's true that I have studied both Rappler in the Philippines and Maverick in South Africa, looking in detail at both the attacks on your journalists and your journalism, but also the ways in which, you know, your community has supported you and rallied. And that is, I think, Ferial, the most visceral example of a powerful connection and relationship with your audience that I've ever heard, actually. That, you know, and in Maria's case, they're holding rallies to defend her and press freedom against the charges she's facing, and to offer, you know, the professional counselling services that you know, have in your area of expertise to journalists is truly remarkable. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I just want to come back to the issue now of, we've talked a lot now about journalism safety issues, and we're seeing that even at this very early stage in our survey, very much the issues of psychological well-being and injury and emotional well-being and susceptibility being identified. People are, you know, angry, they're sad about losing their jobs, but they're also worried about how long they can go on, you know. And I think, you know, you've addressed those issues really well. But what about the other challenges connected to media freedom? We've, you know, come off 18 months or so of, for the first time in my long career as a journalist, genuine international recognition of the global problem of media freedom threats, whereas previously we, in the West, in the developed West, often looked at this as a challenge or a set of challenges facing news organizations, you know, in the global South, or where dictators were bound to be suppressing independent journalism. We learned through the creeping attacks on journalists in Europe and through the weaponization of terms like fake news in the US and the growing attacks on journalists there, that this was indeed a challenge for all of us. But at the same time, we've seen a significant escalation of these risks and some new threats emerging in the context of COVID-19. And we're seeing that in particular, and again, this is being borne out through our survey data, where these issues intersect with disinformation. So journalists being targeted and harassed as a result of their work to try and hold powerful people to account, particularly when they're reporting, for example, that a president or a prime minister has lied about a particular issue or has presented information in a way that is utterly misleading or even deadly or dangerous, you know, as the case may be. Can I start with you, Inga, because CNN is one of those news organizations that is frequently targeted by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, often referred to as fake news. And there have been many column inches and bites devoted to analyzing the impact of that situation on CNN and the Washington Post and the New York Times and so on. But in the context of this crisis, how are you experiencing this? I mean, you've had your reporters berated and attacked before, but are things more difficult now? And if they are, how are you responding?
Well, I mean, I think it's it's a sad truth that our journalists have become very used to and resilient to those attacks. And I think on the whole, we are just you know, trying to do our job, and we'll continue to try to do our job. When it's made harder for us to do it, we'll find other ways. So our politics team, for example, has launched this sort of facts first that will continue to go, where we basically scrutinize what the politicians are saying and what is accurate. You know, and we base that on the facts. And so I think that, you know, by doing our jobs, by doing good journalism, you know, that will eventually cut through. And we're definitely seeing that in the spike of audiences that we're getting, that people are trusting, you know, the brands that have been willing to put their necks out, have been willing to kind of, you know, call out inaccuracies, hold the government to account, be that, you know, Donald Trump or Boris Johnson or Duterte or any other, you know, leader in the world. I think that that is definitely something that is in our DNA and we'll continue to do it. I guess where I am concerned around misinformation and how we debunk that is around, and Ferial mentioned that, it's about the sort of beat specialization. We are dealing in areas that, you know, I mean, vaccines, cures, you know, we're dealing in areas that we might not have, or not all organizations, you know, and I'm not singling out CNN here at all, because, you know, we are actually lucky enough to have some, but, you know, overall in the sort of, how do we tackle that? How do we know that this is the cure? Why do we give, you know, airtime to a certain vaccine trial and not another and stuff. And I do worry a little bit about those sort of areas where we might lack beat expertise in dealing with those things. I am less concerned about us not being able to hold governments to account, because I do feel that that is so much in our blood anyway.
Ferial, I know that political power has shifted in South Africa semi-recently, but you spent years dealing with the president in Zuma, where there was encroaching threats to press freedom, and where there was a need to hold powerful people to account in that context while you were under attack for doing so. Have you got any lessons to share about those experiences of trying to bring your audience with you, for example, when you're under fire or under assault, if what you're trying to do is to report in a way that holds powerful people to account by pointing out that they may be wrong, or they may be lying, or so on and so forth?
So we did have that epidemic of trolling related to what we call state capture, or that's kind of grand corruption. But I must say that the trolling armies appear to have been gone to sleep, or they've just been put out of business by the welter of information and by people looking for true information in what the WHO has called what's a good information epidemic. I think that's what
yes, infodemic. I would like to ban all of these words when it's over, but that's a minor point. Sorry, carry on.
I'm afraid I've already used them. Too late.
So what you've seen, and I saw a very interesting Pew global study, is that because of the amount of that rubbish going around, mostly on WhatsApp, actually, and because of the US president saying the things that he has, actually there's been a flocking to the big news sites to try and get the true information. And that's why, I mean, I want to say later, maybe we have more fact checkers than we have journalists now, but I do think this is where the generation of fact checkers that have been built up in the past few years have really come into their own to very quickly debunk that stuff. And for me, better ways of getting it out there quickly than I've seen before.
Maria, you probably have more experience than any other individual on the planet in dealing with, the tides, the different ways in which this is deployed. So maybe kind of, what's your perspective on this?
At the beginning of the lockdown, our disinformation networks didn't know how to handle it. When real people who were stuck at home started going online and becoming extremely critical of President Duterte and his late night addresses. Early on in the first month and a half, he would address around 11 o'clock to midnight. And so there was a point in time, I think this would be April Fools. On April 1, President Duterte gave a late night address where he warned violators of the quarantine that the police and the military he told them, shoot them dead. And then that night, Filipinos came out, and for the very first time, something we never thought would ever happen, #Oust Duterte now trended #1 in the Philippines. It trended globally. And then the next day, within 2 days, the troll army was back in force, and there was an opposing hashtag. So we saw, escalation. It was like watching weapons of mass destruction trying to come after each other, but real people stuck on because, strangely, the fear of the virus, the fear of not seeing any real testing done, #mass testing was one of the hashtags. So we saw for the first 2 months, I think it was a lot of Filipinos are still engaged. And then when ABS-CBN was shut down on May 5th, the troll armies were out in full force. And with a twist, they were far more visceral, far more vicious. And it was connected with the police Facebook accounts and military Facebook accounts trying to portray journalists and activists, the people they believed were critics, the critics and enemies, as enemies of the state. Literally, there's a Filipino phrase called red tagging. red tagging means painting someone as part of the Communist Party of the Philippines, which are deemed a terrorist organization, right? So this happened a few weekends ago, and the battle still continues. I have lots more new memes that are every single, back to Ferial when we were talking about, you know, what animal have you not been called? And then the sexualized attacks against women. It has gotten worse. And it's strange because it's all mixed in with ABS-CBN, right? So there are lots of new accounts on Twitter. Having said that, again, I think what we're seeing though are the journalists who, remember for us, again, I've said 4 years. So we've developed a thicker skin. We are trying very hard to work together much more. But here's what's interesting. It wasn't until the troll armies attacked a star of ABS-CBN that their fans came out, and then all of a sudden a homegrown movement, #WeBlockAs1. They actually went and ran after the troll army, what will I call it? Government disinformation networks, and real people who were the targets of information operations, right? People who defend the president because they really believe he's the best leader we've had.
That's really fascinating, Maria, and it takes me back to your earlier experiences, you know, before the election of Rodrigo Duterte, for example, where you were much more aligned, and in the immediate aftermath with your audiences online, and in the immediate aftermath, much more inclined to seek their support to defend you, you know, in the midst of this onslaught. And you've highlighted there some of the press freedom struggles that we're seeing around the world, which we won't go into now, but which we ask about in the survey, which include threats of arrest, threats of physical harm, online violence, the misuse of legislation like so-called fake news laws against journalists. You know, there are myriad new threats and attacks or escalations that we need to be mindful of. And I'll just point out that in parallel at ICFJ and in partnership with UNESCO, we are undertaking a global study on online violence against female journalists. So we will revisit this stuff in detail. But I have a question for Emily now. You, Emily, really wrote, I think, one of the seminal pieces on platform journalism, what you called sort of post-industrial journalism, that outlined the potential impacts of platform dependency, you know, before we started coming up with terms like platform capture and a whole bunch of other things to describe what you saw very early on. And we're seeing here in the midst of this pandemic a return to, or an escalation of, reliance on you know, social media platforms, particularly for distribution, even for reporting. You know, the strengths of those platforms have been well demonstrated, but also the risks that they entail. So what are you thinking at the moment? What concerns do you have, and what can you share with us in the way of insights about the risks and perhaps how to be mindful of them before they come to bite us?
I'd love to hear from the rest of the panel about this as well, but just to, you know, something that the Tau Centre has been looking at for the last sort of five years or so. And I mean, just as this pandemic, I think, is accelerating all sorts of trends, it's accelerating the trends of platforms being much more directly involved in journalism and journalistic decisions than they have ever been. And we see this in both big ways and small ways. So we see it in big ways in the way that I think sort of Facebook is taking more and more, as it were, what I would call editorial decisions in public. It's appointed an oversight board, which, you know, I have my doubts about. It feels like a public relations initiative to me, but, you know, I'll hold judgment until they start to actually operate. I think that it's really highlighted the fact, particularly in certain markets, you know, the American local journalism market is the most obvious example of that, of how really, even with large numbers of readership, if you don't have an advertising model, then it's very hard to continue to operate unless you do, as Inga was saying, build your own destination. And people are going, I think, sort of straight to sort of destinations. But I don't think that is, as it were, a long-term trend. So I think that what we're seeing is actually a big step up and increase in how platforms are involving themselves in journalism. the small ways in which they're doing it, which could be viewed as beneficial, they are both, Google and Facebook both creating emergency funds for funding journalism. The sums of money involved in those are incredibly small compared to the overall sums of money that the companies are making out of the advertising market. And I think that my personal concern about it is that that money is the only money there is. It is definitely better than nothing, but it should not be how we think about funding and protecting journalism in the long term. And in fact, I've been speaking to a few experts just recently who said it may even weaken things because it's not really addressing the core issue of how you get long-term stability into this. And I think it's really interesting how when you hear somebody like Inga talking about what CNN does, they're a large organization that has the resilience to allow their journalists to take time away from the screen to make sure their healthcare costs are paid, etc., etc. And we have successful journalistic outlets on this call, but there are lots of excellent outlets that are not being successful at the moment. And I think the platform part in that is going to increase, but we don't have a policy that governs it. We don't have a lot of oversight of it. But as I say, I'd like to hear what everybody else thinks about that, because I'm observing it to some extent from the outside. Maria's nodding violently.
Yeah. So I loved everything that you said, Emily, and I agree with a lot of it. I think that the plus side, I think, because here lies can kill, right? So they're actually taking content down. The platforms are doing things that they hadn't really embraced before, and then going beyond that. And what I'm hoping is that we begin to see that move into political disinformation. But I think if we think broader, and jumping off that wonderful paper that you did, oh my God, oh so long ago, it feels like a lifetime ago now. But jumping off of that, I think what we're going to see is, in order to survive, journalists are going to have to actually truly embrace data and technology, so that we don't leave it in tech's hands. And, when I talked about us hiring, the people we were hiring weren't reporters like shoe leather reporters. We're hiring young folks who are learning data tech, we're building a platform. We're rolling out a platform that we were building while we were under attack, it's in beta now, and we hope to finish the full rollout by next week, right? We decided to do that because the future of journalism is intertwined with technology, but technology in the hands of journalists is very, very different from technology in the hands of engineers who don't take responsibility for the public sphere.
You were in fact working on that when I was embedded with you during a study.
Yes, it's a year, almost a year and a half, I think.
Indeed, right? And watching, I have to say to everybody, watching Rappler and particularly the all-female leadership team of Rappler forging ahead with this, despite the extraordinary external threats and pressures, was inspiring. And I think it'd be great, Maria, if we can in fact incorporate what you learn as you go in this project, because it does address directly.
But you know what I would say? I would actually say that part of what allowed us to survive the attacks was being able to build something. We call it Lighthouse, this new platform, and it really is that, when I was getting arrested, in fact, the second time I was coming from somewhere else, but the first time I got arrested, I was in a meeting, and we were trying to figure out how do we change the classification of our websites to shift it from older ways of classification that we used to do as journalists. So one of the things we've done is topics to movements, right? Something simple, but how do you, to get to that simplicity, just like writing a story, means you go through so much complexity. And then I began to understand technology and the way engineers think also, because they're almost the complete opposite of the way we journalists think. But I am absolutely convinced that the stable world of journalism will happen after technology and journalism fuse. And that's a little scary, because who will be in charge? Will it be the journalists or will it be the technologists?
It's. I mean, I think that's a great point. My view is that change of control is already taking place, and the answer is it's not the journalists. But that's not
but we can take it back.
We can take it back. Well, that brings us on to, and we've got so many great questions actually coming in. So we should throw the questions over to you, the audience. But actually, that just in terms of, you know, those innovations, you've talked about platform build, Maria there at Rappler, Inga talked about CNN actually sort of finding that its own destinations were working. Ferial, you're in a sort of a different position, if you like. But just what are the innovations and opportunities? It seems really inappropriate to talk about opportunities coming out of what is a tragedy and a terrible event, but just in terms of sort of how do we build a better resilient form of journalism, and what are the kind of innovations, both HR, human innovations and technical innovations that we need to do that, I think is a question that sort of presses on my mind a lot. Inga, I don't know what your thoughts are about what you would like us to be doing, or what you know, the things that you've spotted and said this is actually something we will keep on the other side of all of this awfulness.
Yeah, it's a big question, this one, isn't it? I think I want to take it a little bit to a research that Lucy Coombe did a while back, and I think that the sort of innovation is often sort of linked to the sort of shiny things in journalism, and I think that maybe focusing less on that, you know, focusing more on the kind of you know, because at the end of the day, what has got us through this period and what is getting us through the, you know, issue around you know, that we talked about before, about how we're being, you know, how it's getting more and more difficult to hold people to account, is actually just the old-fashioned good journalism. That is what has sustained this. No shiny object has helped us with that. So I almost feel like what I would like to see, you know, and call it innovation or whatever, is that is exactly what Lucy was saying, and I'm speaking for my organization, is that we really take a hard look at how are we operating now, and is that sustainable and viable in the future, and those conversations is you know, something that I you know, will happen, and I think that would be the biggest innovation to come at it from my end, is that we really look at workflows, think about what the organization needs to look at 5 or 10 years from now in order for it to stay as strong as it is right now.
And may I come in just quickly? I think that, I want to just step back a little bit. I think I've noticed a remetering of the power relationship with the platforms and the public, if not the publishers, because suddenly you've seen Facebook, Google, and Twitter being the best version of themselves I've seen in a long time in terms of directing audience to good information. And I noticed there's a new reply function on Twitter, which has made my life much nicer on that platform, because you can determine who replies to your tweets. That's really been great. But there's another side to it. So for example, we're on the receiving end of one of those Facebook pots of money. And I must say there, the relationship hasn't been remeted at all. I think on a previous call, Julie, I've said that I found the approach of Facebook almost neo-colonial in how it sets the terms of how support will be given. So I hope sometime in our few remaining minutes, we will be able to speak a little bit about how does that future look in order to encourage the innovations that are off platform, because you have seen them. Yeah, and just a funny story that again Ori pointed out to me. Suddenly TikTok has become a great form of holding leaders to account. Certainly where I live, one of the best campaigns opposing a really stupid lockdown regulation happened on TikTok, which I found quite surprising. Huh?
Yeah, and with each new platform come a new set of challenges. It's probably important to highlight. But yes, we will come back to those issues, but we do now need to go to questions from our very patient participants. And we have just over half an hour to devote to those questions, and also to come back to that question of where do we throw this, you know, how do we try and reimagine a future journalism, which is what you're getting at there, Ferial. So the first question I'd like to put to you, and Maria, you might want to add to this, but others might feel that it's also something that they can add value to. It comes from Joseph Bernard Marzan, who says he's working at a local newspaper in the Philippines, and he asks a really important question about the implications for local media, local journalism, and how that might be dealt with. And these outlets that you guys represent are, of course, national outlets with some international footprint in the case of Maria and Ferial, but also a global outlet in the case of CNN. But if you turn your minds to the cost of COVID-19 for local journalism, it's a really, really shocking story. Do you want to start, Maria, given your perspective on the Philippines?
You know, you're fighting two wars. It's the business war of the survival aspect, especially since lockdown, cash flow becomes a problem. And then you're fighting a government that is trying to prevent you from holding it to account, right? So how do we deal with that? I guess I think, number one, you can't do it alone. So one of the things we keep trying to figure out is how can we consolidate? How can we collaborate? What can we build together, right? So I also think here, the other part is that in this time period, like throw away everything and experiment. Start just imagining what it can be, right? So, and part of that is because I think the reason we survived this war of attrition was when the government tried to shut us down in January of 2018, our advertising, and we were largely dependent on advertising at that point. By April 2018, our advertising dropped to 50%. And yet we haven't laid people off at all, because what we did by the time it hit that, our team came together and actually said, what are we doing as journalists that we can turn into a product that other companies, our advertisers who were too scared at that point to advertise in us, that they need? What can we as journalists offer that is unique, that allows us? And you know, strangely, what we looked at is how we were taking apart the disinformation networks, how we were using natural language processing, investigative processes that used data and technology. And that's how we built a B2B model that grew 1,200%. And that is how we actually made money last year. So whatever that is now, wherever we are, think that you're standing on the rubble. Everything is tragic around us. But if you accept that it is tragic and you're standing in the rubble, then you're going to have to create. And I think that's what we have to do.
I think you're muted, Emily. It's the old Zoom mute.
It's the old Zoom mute problem, yeah. So there's, just sort of picking up on that point about Maria's, there are a couple of questions that relate to that, which I think I'm sort of going to try and conflate them. So apologies if I don't get to exactly your question. But there's one here from Dahlia Ashmawi to all panelists, which has been on my mind a lot, where she says, how do you see now the shift to the multimedia journalists having their own channels and being funded from platforms like YouTube and Facebook? And I would say not even just from YouTube and Facebook. I've noticed just in the past few months an increasing emphasis, even from very legacy organizations like the New York Times, to produce around single journalists. And I know it's more of a broadcast model already, but just that idea of, is that a different model? And Ferial, I sort of want to come to you with that, because another question is from Rick Dunham, which sort of relates to that, which is, what are the specific challenges for digital native outlets? Because whilst we're talking about legacy and print, we've also seen a huge number of digitally native outlets dependent on advertising or events fold, or certainly sort of have to reduce. I'm sorry, there are two questions there, but maybe Ferial, if I come to you first, and then to Inga and Maria.
Sure, Emily. So obviously the big one is that you don't have a large capital reserve to build your innovations off. And so you're self-funding, bootstrapping, keeping your newsrooms quite tight. But I suppose what's been different with us, and it's been very sad for me in the past few weeks to see HuffPost losing more people, BuzzFeed, Vice, because all of us thought that these were going to be the great innovators, is I love the Daily Maverick model, which is a three-legged model, some advertising, philanthropic support, and a third leg, which is your members. And certainly that is a method of the CEO and the editor that's worked very, very well for the Maverick. Whether it's transportable or exportable, I'm not sure, but it really is quite a working one now. And it also means that you don't have to chase that scale you were speaking about in your latest report.
Microphone, Emily.
Sorry, Maria, what's your view of, what's your view of that?
I think everyone has shifted a lot more resources to social media. The last stats I saw with Facebook was a growth of something like 23% during this time of pandemic. And ABS-CBN, the largest broadcaster, at least for us, has shifted everything online. So what's happened? It's more chaotic. There's more competition. It is a competition for, it's Tim Wu's The Attention Merchants, right? And that brings other challenges for the rest of us. We are digital. Rappler was born digital. We don't have anything else. So the challenge now for us is to try to take the best of what the platforms offer, but also to be able to build on our own. And so again, I go back to the collaborating part, right? So how do you survive it? First, diversify all your revenue streams, and then look at what you're doing for yourself, and then see if there's a way that can be productized. And then you draw that line in between and then give that to your sales team, right? I think the other part is, social media platforms are here to stay, and we could get in an hours long conversation about this, Emily. So how do we co-opt them, right? Because the other way doesn't work, and I think they understand how they need journalists now, and they should have understood it much earlier. But you know, they need somebody to police the public sphere. We're one of Facebook's fact-checking partners, and it isn't enough to be able to, you do get paid a small amount, and it isn't enough to do anything meaningful in journalism. But it's something, and it helps in our purpose of trying to kick the lies out, right? But I think that model that we're all still looking for, it's a work in progress, and what keeps the North Star there is understanding still that journalism without technology, that the technology is as important now, and that distribution, somehow we must reclaim distribution back. And how do we do that without all of the millions and hundreds of millions of dollars of the technology platforms?
That's actually a great prompt, and I really want to hear Inga thought on this, because I know we've spoken separately in the past about that problem of, you know, kind of, we went through a phase of social media distribution, big social media teams, and then there's a sort of actually kind of that issue of audience growth and management on different platforms. How you thought a lot about this, Inga? What are you thinking about it now?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of points that I think are sort of, I mean, first of all, you know, if we look at the sort of models that we've talked about that are going to be revenue streams, I mean, subscription has come up like a lot in the last sort of 2 years. Well, subscription models does favor the publishers and values the publisher, but the platforms have made it really clear, you know, the Silicon Valley has said that the platforms are favored over the publishers. So there's a conflict between those two, and definitely doesn't bode well for sort of distribution in our industry with revenue. So, but then we have to look at, you know, do we have to ask for either or, you know, demand data or revenue from them? I mean, the platforms, you know, I would argue, built some of their reputation on the backs of good journalism, and we gave it to them for quite a long time, very willingly. So so the question is now, you know, where do we take it from there? And I mean, I think that every news organization, including ours, is in some kind of works with these platforms in one way or another. I mean, we've done town halls with them recently, which have been very successful, but have also been, you know, paid for, or there has been an agreement with Facebook around that. So we're not giving our content away anymore. They have paid us for that. But I mean, I think that the main thing for us and is that, we cannot bottle up the internet. I mean, we have to accept that it's a distributed in its nature, and that's what makes it so amazing. And that's why we some of us, speak for myself here, was attracted to digital journalism in the first place. And and I speak from a position of privilege because we have the ability and the opportunity to exist on multiple platforms where we can, where our own platform, our own brand is very strong, and we can stay there, and we can still allow ourselves to look at how we use social media. But I would say that we have radically changed our view on how we work with them from where we were in 2015, say, and we now see that this cannot be just a one-way direction, and I think that our sort of recent interactions with them have definitely been in that vein.
Look forward to digging into that some more, Inga, and your response to the survey as well. We've had several questions about access to information, particularly from people participating from East Africa and indeed India, who are pointing out that it is difficult to hold officials accountable when you can't get access to scientists who perhaps the state wants to suppress from speaking because they might have a view that does not sit well with the politics, and other means of trying to hold people to account when there are limitations on internet access, for example. These are things that have been raised, and they're really important points, and we do dig into this in the study, in the survey. But there are other issues that people are raising in connection with this theme that go to trust. So if we are, as journalists or as news organizations, to try to combat mis and disinformation, which I have to say, scrolling through this this massive flood of comments we've got, is one of the main themes that people are asking about. But if you can't access that information, how do you try and counter disinformation with accurate, reliable, trustworthy information? What are the implications for your audience when you're asking them to trust you? Several people have made points along those lines, and I'll just offer this specific question to you guys to think about tying this all together, because it comes back to the implications of doing things so much more digitally and in a distanced way. From Hazel Friedman: although, and I don't know where you are, Hazel, I'm sorry, but although our physical mobility has been constrained by COVID-19, as investigative journalists, it remains imperative to engage with communities and individuals who trust us with the responsibility to tell their stories. This does mean going into the field, into spaces where digital access may be a luxury that most can't afford. Unless we physically do this, we're in danger of becoming stuck in a cloistered, rarefied environment, out of touch with the crucial issues on the ground that affect the communities on whose behalf we purport to speak. I think that's a powerful commentary and also a question. Perhaps I'll start with you, Ferial. You referred to a report that I wrote around scale breaking community, which was also for the Reuters Institute. And it went to this need for physical encounter as a potential antidote. And now we find ourselves in an environment where we can't physically connect in ways that we're used to. Is there a risk that that becomes the norm and that trust is from our sources or our audiences is therefore further eroded?
So Hazel is a very well-known and respected investigative journalist from South Africa. I think she works for one of the larger institutions for television. And there I've seen our journalists going everywhere because they do have requisite protections. And from what I've seen, they've been wearing PPE. Where the problem does lie, as many of our colleagues from East Africa would be pointing out, is where you don't have promotion of access to information. So even getting the models that your government or scientists may be working on is being extremely difficult. Year two, you see the value of having a very strong civil society, which kept up such a campaign that eventually last week government held a very long press conference and made all those models public, which I think is vital for kind of public inspection and for wider dissemination. But as to Hazel's question, so I can just share what the Daily Maverick has done is to really build very good citizen network so that you ensure you don't become the rarefied, cosseted, only giving out the official line, but that you are deeply rooted in communities. Is it perfect? Not at all. Around the world, news deserts are the story of our time, but to improve that kind of two-way communication using the tools at our disposal is something that we're quite seized with.
Maria, yeah.
Yeah, so I'll build on what Ferial said. I think that not only we are not alone, right? For example, in order to check government, there's a community of about 50 volunteers who every week will take down what the president has given to Congress to show where he has spent money. And every week they actually, because they're skilled they're skilled in accounting and budgetary processes. They tell us things like, just checking what they've done with us, they said that only 18% of our health budget that is available during this emergency period has been spent, only 18%. So that already tells you there's a problem with the process of distribution of governance, right? And then the other part is, if you can't get it here in your home, then you can also take a look at the data in other parts in terms of how the virus, because it's frankly, the entire world is not going to be safe until the weakest link, until the country with the weakest system is safe. And so that's part of what we're trying to look at. But don't forget the people who are there. If you can't get to them, in the Philippines, even though the internet isn't ubiquitous, and cell phones are, it's 114, 117% penetration rate for cell phones. And some of the stories where we couldn't go to, where urban poor are more afraid of hunger, of not getting help from the government than they are of the virus, they've taken photos for us. And then doing the work that we can do, we can still tell their stories. There are, I think, many ways to get around this. The world has changed. And, frankly, also, we must protect our journalists as well. So we want to do both. And how do we do that? How do we do it in the safest way? How do we hold power to account?
Inga, I remember sort of when I was doing this kind of work at The Guardian, that actually CNN were very, very early on with CNN eyewitness reports. One of my colleagues actually at Columbia Journalism School, Doolin too, who's our brilliant video instructor, said that one of the things that his classes had learned that was most valuable was teaching their sources how to shoot video inside hospitals or other areas. I'm wondering whether this sort of use of UGC and those networks that both Ferial and Maria are talking about is actually going to be, it's like something from 2005, like podcasting, which suddenly comes back into its own again, that we almost feel like we've sort of discarded or haven't paid enough attention to. How does something like, how does CNN think about sort of that UGC or, participant media type model?
Well, I mean, you're right. It is quite 2005. It's where we were all in at the time, and I think we sort of felt like maybe we'd moved on to sort of other things and stuff. But this has definitely thrown up the question about how are we going to gather in these areas. I mean, it is, as I said in the beginning, exceptionally hard for us to get there. So we have to then think about other ways and we've been, looking, I mean, we have been running a series on CNN called As Equals, which focuses on gender equality. And part of that series is to really empower journalists on the ground in areas where we don't normally get to send us content and do their own stories. So I think that model is something that, should be looked at and might possibly come back as it becomes harder for us to sort of get there. I mean, equally, you have to question, those are the people who will have the expertise on the ground. Those are the people who can tell the stories in the best way. And if I can just end on, saying and, expressing my appreciation and admiration for people who are, doing journalism in these really, really hard, difficult places and getting it out. I have nothing but total respect for them.
Do you have another question, Emily, that you've taken from the participants that you'd like to put?
Yes, actually, this is an upbeat question, so readjust your, well, maybe it's an upbeat question, which is, we've got lots of people on the thread. Apologies for not name checking all of you, but you're all asking the same question, which is, young journalists, people graduating from my class, people coming into the field, what's the most important thing for them to know and the skills for them to have, and what should they be doing to make an impact at a time when it's actually, as we've just been discussing, difficult even for professional journalists to get out there and report? Who wants to take that first? Who wants to advise a whole generation of young journalists
who have just come off, you know, a decade of people saying journalism is dead, don't study journalism, and people like Emily and I saying, no, it's the new bachelors of humanities, just do the journalism.
Well, I might as well kick off, although you have stolen my thunder here a little bit. But you know, first of all, I always feel slightly old when I'm giving advice. But you know, first of all, don't give up. I mean, the profession needs good people right now. There's no doubt about it. I mean, you hear about these layoffs and everything, but that doesn't mean that fresh blood isn't a very valuable and good things. And everyone has something different to offer. You know, so I would say that that's the one thing, is the sort of confidence and believe that, you know, journalism is and will remain an important part of society, whatever shape it's going to take. And I think that the other thing is like looking into the skill sets that is needed right now. And, you know, I think that is a really important thing. It's like having just one string in your bow is probably not going to get you anywhere. So I think that really leaning into where are the audiences now, what kind of journalism do you want to tell for that audience, and understanding that is probably what the advice that I would give to anyone.
Great, thank you. Yes, Maria.
I think this is an incredible time to be a journalist. And I know that sounds slightly foolish, but you know, you will create what journalism will become. Because I use the word rubble all the time. You are standing on the rubble of our generation, right? I mean, we are having creative destruction. The destruction has happened. And now we're having to create. And imagine coming in at a time when the people who are much older than you are as lost as you are, number one. And number two, your creativity, idealism, your digital skills, all of these things. What should you focus on? My bias, data, technology. Yep. Yes, tell stories. We need to tell stories, but we still haven't really found the best way to use data and tech in the same way that we know, like Inga and I, like that we know how to tell a television story. I think that's still there to be discovered, and our societies need you now more than ever.
I have to say, as somebody who's advocated long and hard for being for much better data journalism without being a data journalist myself, I've been enormously encouraged by some of what we've seen. Not all of it, but by some of what we've seen during coronavirus. And I think if we're coming away from this with one thing, it's learn statistics, learn some computation, learn some tools.
Excel.
Well, I was going to say, I have colleagues who have dusty views about Excel, but yes, even Excel is a good tool. Yes, and also know what a story is. I know that sounds very simple, but know what a story is. Ferial, what would you be telling young journalists coming to you?
I guess a bit like Barack Obama's commencement address, look, we messed it up, it's yours for the taking, remake it. But often I find young people are pushed into generalist positions and discouraged from specialization. And what this has taught me is we need a generation of excellent health reporters. Mm-hmm. And then I just looked at that New York Times front page, but also the digital iteration.
It was remarkable.
And it was absolutely beautiful. And to see the role of charts in our lives every morning, the first thing you do is go and look, is I think with our young people coming into the profession with those skills, it really is your moment. Okay?
Which brings us neatly to one of the other questions from the panel, which goes back to storytelling. And various people, again, some in Africa, some in India, some in Latin America, asking questions about what is perceived to be audience fatigue with the story of COVID-19 and its myriad impacts and manifestations. Also about editors who want clickbaity headlines because they think that's all that's going to drag people back to this fundamentally, vital story. And I'm going to start with you, Inga, because we're an all-female panel here. I'm just going to mention that again. It's a very rare thing. It's kind of almost newsworthy in and of itself. But I'm asking you because CNN has been doing some fairly creative things in terms of responding to what is often a sidebar phenomenon of a pandemic, and that is that women's voices get muted and they become rather invisible. I mean, we've seen, apart from a few exceptions, walls of men talking about this crisis and how we should respond to it, certainly in the UK, the US and Australia, my homeland, for example. But can you talk us through how you make a story like this, particularly in the context of a 24-hour news channel, compelling and humane and engaging, particularly in an area like gender that can be tricky?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would probably challenge a bit that there is audience fatigue. I know that some surveys in certain markets have shown that, but definitely globally, our experience so far is that there is still an incredible amount of thirst for knowledge and good stories and good analysis of what is going on. We have really from the get-go really started to look at the inequality as part of this, this story. I mean, I know that in the beginning, a lot of people and, celebrities and stuff came out and said it's the great leveler. Well, it's proven to be anything but. And the inequality bucket that it has, the issues that have come up are really vast. And I put any kind of inequality in that, class, race, gender, or demography, the geographicals, you name it. But you asked me specifically about gender, and we have done quite a few stories. So I think that one is around the lockdowns. There was perhaps, and arguably, and our reporting has shown, not enough consideration given to a lot of things around the lockdown. So we saw a spike in gender-based violence. We saw restricted access to family planning. We reported on all those stories and they all did very well. There was absolutely no clickbait involved in that. And it was certainly a topic that was difficult to deal with. I mean, the economics of things right now is also another big section. I mean, the jobs that have been lost, a lot of them have been in the service sector, which disproportionately hits women. That is likely to continue into the next phase of this, which is the recovery, where previous crises have really shown that women are often the biggest losers of any recovery plans. And, we've basically written a story with that headline, saying that more men are dying from COVID, but actually it's going to be women who bear the brunt of it. And I am not seeing, as we look at these stories, that there is no interest in it. I truly believe that if you do good reporting and you find compelling cases, that people will come to it. And I am, exceptionally proud that CNN as a mainstream media has, really been leaning into these topics, because I think that is very important. One other area that I really want to mention here is that one thing is for us to highlight the issues that it raises, and I've mentioned a few of them here. But I think another one for us is also to hold the governments to account, not just on the issues, but actually those groups that are underrepresented and are likely to be hit by these recovery. Where are they represented when these decisions are being made? So asking the questions, who was at the table when you decided to give money to X, Y, and Z? Who are the people who are dealing with those issues? And I would put newsroom into that bracket as well. It's more important than ever for us to look at the diversity within our industry and and how we are tackling that, because we will not be able to do this story justice, which we are going to be reporting on this for months, if not years to come. And there's going to be so many angles on it. And if we don't have a diverse enough workforce that can tackle all of these stories, we will not be doing the audience justice, nor the story, nor our profession. So, I have been, I don't know how to sort of frame it, but I've been, surprised but incredibly relieved and pleased to see that there has been audience interest in a story that of that magnitude that the inequality is.
Yeah, extraordinary. Not to mention the fact that we see such disproportionate impacts of the disease itself on minorities, you know, in developed Western countries, which is a really vital aspect of the story.
Yes, I think it's a sort of a spot on as well on the idea of accountability, which is something we could do a whole extra hour on. But we're kind of running. We're running up to time.
Running out.
We're running out of time. So I wanted to just ask everybody very quickly, starting with you, Ferial, one last question, which is, let's think ourselves forward in 12 months' time. What are the things that you are? How will the industry look? What are the things that you're hopeful about, and what are the things that you fear?
What I'm hopeful about is the many, many bright sparks that I'm seeing. So a young Kenyan man, James Smart, who's really doing location-based reporting, making sure that relief money is getting right into Kibera and other really poor areas, using a network of people, and he's doing that with a small startup funding. And I'm seeing that in South Africa, I'm seeing it all across our continent. And then what else I suppose gives me hope is the marvelous writers who are directing us into what this pandemic is showing us. So Rebecca Solnit in The Guardian, showing us the real new solidarities that we've seen being built, is how our societies are changing. I'm loving that. And then specifically for us here is Nanja Nyabola, the writer. She wrote a beautiful piece in The Nation where she said there's no archive in Africa of how previous pandemics have been captured. It's always been outside in viewing, and this is a real opportunity for us journalists here to tell the story. So I'd say to colleagues who are saying, my editors are getting tired of it, dig deep, people, because I agree with Inga, it's going to be with us for a very long time.
That's a terrific point about it's not just reporting, it's record as well. I think that's so important. Maria?
Courage rising. Courage rising. I mean, I just look at the stats in the Philippines, and there's a lot that I'm afraid of. The fact that we're a country of 110 million people, and yet about 300,000 tests have been done. Only 300,000, right? And aside from the lack of tests, we have a lot of arrests. Almost 55,000 arrests during lockdown. We don't know what's happening. Our people need food. So let me not go to the worst case scenarios, because I think that we can imagine some of those. Best case scenarios for me, right? Best case scenarios. Courage rising. People speak together. People come together. We find civic engagement in a post-COVID age to protect our democracy, to protect ourselves, to demand accountability for our government. Journalism gets more vibrant, finds a way to push through. Again, I don't know what that will look like. I can look at what we're doing. I can look what other Filipino groups, our news groups, are trying to do. And one of the things that has changed is that we are all working much more closely together. That's great. There's a lot of work to do. We are just at the beginning of destruction. I mean, once we come out of lockdown and we look at the economy and its devastation, then we begin to create.
That's great. I think it's such a powerful point about collaboration as well. Inga, you get the last word on this.
So if I could start with what my sort of fears are, and that's around plurality in news. I do think that that is exceptionally important. So as we see colleagues at other organizations and some organizations struggling, I worry about certain voices disappearing for now at least. And, you know, those of us who might still be left standing, we are better if we have a stronger competition. So, you know, that would definitely be, for me, a point that is out there, which is why I'm really pleased that you're doing the survey that you're doing, because understanding the effect that it's having and how we can maybe counter it is exceptionally important. On the sort of more optimistic note, I think that, you know, we have an opportunity here to see some of the best journalism of our time out of this story. I think it has given us opportunities to get into areas that we haven't had the attention that they've had before. We've mentioned inequality. I want to mention the environment as another one. You know, the planet is showing us something here, and we as journalists can get into stories that were, frankly, you know, we can all admit a bit of a tough sell before, but is now very much a big reality of everyone's lives. So I do think that there is scope for us to move into areas that we might not have done before and do some exceptional journalism around that. So that is what gives me hope.
Extraordinary, and I'm amazed that we've managed to end on a truly inspiring and optimistic note considering the topic. In fact, I just want to read to you from Vijay Shankar Balakrishnan. I'm apologizing in advance for probably mangling that name. But he or she says, I wish this session would never end and that we could keep on exploring options. And yes, the fact that this panel is all women is empowering. So I think that's another great note to end on. And I'm just going to get you all to say it with me. Please do the survey. Please do the survey.
Please do the survey.
Please do the survey.
Please do the survey.
Sorry, I was going to say we put the link in the chat. You'll also find it on ICFJ's website, and you can contact Emily and I via a specific email address, which is pandemicproject@icfj.org. And also, you should join, if you haven't already, the ICFJ and IJNet Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum, which you will find routes to from our website. It's currently a Facebook group. And to note that we are rolling this survey out into 5 new languages very soon. And over to you, Emily, to say a final goodbye.
Just to say thank you so much, Ferial Haffajee, Inga, Thordar, and Maria Ressa. It's so great to see you here. I realised actually through this webinar just how much I miss international travel. I thought I would never say that. I can't wait to see you all in person. Thanks for being in the forum. Thanks for your questions. This is the first in a series. If you follow ICFJ or the Tau Centre on Twitter, we will be posting those. Follow us on Facebook. But thanks very much indeed to everyone for making time for this important discussion. Stay safe and see you soon, I hope.
And be hopeful. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.